Welcome to Fly on the Wall podcast. I'm your host, Chris Sonkson, CEO and founder of Church Boom. Here you get to sit in on a live coaching session as I coach pastors through the ministry challenges we all face. If you find this podcast helpful, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Hey, today we're talking with my good friend Mitch. He's got a wonderful church in Nebraska, and we're talking about how do you get people in the church to take ownership? How do you increase the level of ownership from the people in the church? I hope you enjoy the coaching conversation. Well, hey, man, how can I serve you today, man? What's on your mind?
Man, you know what? I started thinking about just the opportunity to ask another pastor some questions that's been a little farther down the road than me. As we have grown, I would say in the last 10 years, we've kind of doubled as a church, and we're not a huge church by any means. We average about 450 adults and everybody. And I think one of the things that I've struggled with the most in the past, several months has to do with delegation. That juxtaposition between wanting it to be done right and on time and handing it off to other staff members. I've grown from, maybe 1.5 staff to about 10 now, part and full time. And I think that delegation piece, here's the thing with it is I've been frustrated in a lack of getting it done on time and with the right degree that I want it to be.
Right.
It's causing this stir in me of frustration. So what kind of tips do you have on, man, how do you help staff follow through? I'm not a great confrontational person for one thing. So that's part of my problem, but
Are you, well, let me ask you a couple follow-up questions. You're talking about the struggle with delegation and whatnot. Do you feel like part of that is on you, or do you feel that you're more of a doer than you are a leader, and maybe that's creating a culture?
Well, I would say yes and yes. Absolutely. I think, in the Strength Finders, one of my top 5 is responsibility. And I am a doer, and I have this ultimate responsibility. And I think sometimes where it's on me would probably be not letting something fall all the way to the ground.
Right.
And because I just, I'll slide in and pick up the pieces. And that could send the message to my staff sometimes of hey, Mitch is going to do it. And then the other question, I kind of been asking myself this question for several months, actually. I feel like in the last couple of weeks, I've started to get a little more clarity. The other thing I'm probably not great at is maybe giving enough detail in my communication of what I'm really asking to be done. And with time frames and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think anytime, Mitch, that culture is always a result of what you promote and what you allow. And when you create a culture that doesn't delegate or that is more of a doing culture, I think that that is part of the allowing part. Secondly is, I know this about culture, it's always created at the top and supported at the bottom. So whatever culture you're creating in your top 2 or 3 people, it's creating all the way down. I think that's, I believe that first you got to look at it and say, okay, how do I make sure that I'm doing the things that need to be done, that I'm staying in the lane of mission critical, that I'm staying in the lanes that I need to be staying in, and I'm not drifting into other lanes because I feel like maybe I'm the only one that can do it or I'm the only one that can get it done. How do I make sure that I'm clear about that my executive team is clear about that we understand that, and then we can start getting that down there and down into the weeds. If there is a team of doers, it will reach a lid eventually. Now, you've grown in the last few years. You talked about that.
No, I'm concerned about that lid.
There's the lid's coming. The lid will come always to the level of the leadership and their ability to lead and raise up teams. Can they lead? Can they raise up teams? Do they develop people? And I always say, man, I tell people all the time, and it's a pretty strong statement, but I always say, if everything has to cross your desk, then you'll only lead things that are small. And you have to get that ability where it's okay, I'm not only learning to delegate. I always say, list all the things you do, list what is mission critical, spend more time in mission critical, and everything else you eliminate, delegate, or automate. Can you look at everything you do and what can be eliminated, what can be delegated, and what can be automated? That's not only an exercise for you. I'm working with a church right now that runs a pretty good sized church. The pastor all the way down, it's like all of them are all over the map. And I'm like, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things you need to be focused on? What can you eliminate, delegate, and automate? It's unbelievable when you start getting into his executives. It's unreal some of the stuff they do. Where I had the guys make a list, and I'm like, why are you doing that at this size of a church? Like, this is crazy. That's not where we want you to spend your time. I'm a baseball guy, so I use baseball analogies. It's like, Mitch pitches a 104-mile-an-hour fastball. Let's put him in left field. Why would we put him in left field? This makes no sense whatsoever. We put him on the mound, and that's what he does. And that's what you have to start creating. Like, okay, I think you have to step back, Mitch, and go, okay, what are the 3 or 4 things I do that I got to spend 60, 70% of my time doing? Question 1. Question 2, everything else, how can I eliminate, delegate, or automate it? What can I do to start releasing that? And how can I stay in the lanes that provide the most fuel for this church? These are the lanes I have to be in. I think that's an exercise for you. That's an exercise for your team. It's called mission critical. It's a whole kind of teaching, but I think that's for you. I think that's for a couple. You start with your exec team and you work your way down. Guys, we stay in our lanes. We focus on growth engines and development engines. Everything else, eliminate, delegate, or automate.
I would say we're growing in that. I've never really had an executive team until the past 2 years, and I think we're learning how to function in that realm. Mm-hmm. And so there's really good things to hear right there.
Yeah, and I think I think we like the idea of it, most people, but the implementation of it becomes a little more difficult because it's like, okay, let's really go through this exercise. Let's really go through what's called the mission critical exercise. Let's go through it and figure out what do we really do? Once we figure that out, you'll find, I think you'll find lids will be broken.
That's good to hear. That's really good to hear. We do a lot of everything.
Yeah.
We on our executive team, we all do a lot of everything. That's part of our problem.
Yeah, that we have a tendency to focus on the urgent rather than the important. It's a tendency that we have, and you got to fight to stay in your lane. Again, hey, Mitch pitches a 104-mile-an-hour fastball. Well, we're not going to put him in left field. We're just not going to do that. We're going to put him on the mound. So it's like, what does Mitch Ivy have to do? If I was the boss, and I'm not, but if I was the boss of you, I'd say, okay, what are the 3 or 4 things we want you spending most of your time doing? What's going to be best for this organization? Let's go to the youth pastor. What do you think is best? Well, I run to Costco and I pick up the snacks for our Wednesday night. Really? Like we got to pay you to run to Costco to pick up the snack? Like that's the best use of your time? And that sounds funny, but if you did a week, what I call a week in the life of, if you did a week in the life of every single staff and didn't tell them what the exercise was for, you would see a lot of stuff where like, man, they're running to Costco picking up stuff and they're making sure the bus is getting gas in it. And they're like, whatever they do, you're going to find like they're spending of their 40 hours or whatever the work week is, they're spending probably a good 35-40% thinking, this is not helping us. This is not going to move us forward. And one little sentence in the mission critical, I mean, it's a whole teaching, but one sentence that is crucial, and it really drives the whole lesson, is if Mitch doesn't do blank, our future is threatened. What's the blank? Now let's go to the youth pastor. If Joe doesn't do blank, our future's threatened. Let's go to the children's pastor. If Jessica doesn't do blank, our future's threatened. What's the blank? I mean, not just what's the blank, like our future is literally threatened if you don't do this. It's not just, the service won't happen. Like, well, I got to run off curriculum for Sunday morning. No, that doesn't threaten our future because we can get someone to do that. But if you don't develop leaders and we decide we want to launch another campus, we're in trouble. If you're not the chief fundraiser and the guy that's constantly creating income and resources, we're in trouble. So now all of a sudden you start realizing like, oh, those things are in trouble. If you don't do blank, our future's threatened. That is how you quickly arrive to those 3 or 4 things that you should be focusing on, and everything else is eliminate, delegate, or automate. Does that help?
It helps a ton. I like it.
Yeah. So there you go.
That's great stuff. That's really, really good. I appreciate that, Chris. It's hard sometimes to get outside of your own head when you're a leader. You're supposed to be solving problems, and you find yourself stuck in some places. It's hard. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
A ton as I've been diving into this whole delegation thing.
Yeah, absolutely. What else you got on your mind today?
I guess I would just have a follow-up question with that, just to take that a step further. So we went from a church that was a couple hundred on a Sunday morning to, a little over 400. In that growth, we've added staff. And in that, staff has done a lot more. But what I've seen, not that we don't have people serving, but I don't see the same level of ownership of people that are serving as they were before. Like, before, some of those volunteers at certain ministries, without them, they were going to crumble because they had ownership. But now there's like this a little bit mentality of, well, the staff will do it. But yet here we're still trying to get people to serve and take ownership. Now serving, they'll serve, but I don't get that same level of like, hey, this is mine. What are some things in your language you would use to communicate to your congregation to get people to take ownership again, where maybe they've just kind of let go of that?
Yeah, that's great. And one thing I would love talking about, I was talking recently on another podcast, I said that membership is about rights, ownership is about responsibility. So some people are in a membership. I'm not a big fan of membership. I don't like it that way. And people are, well, we think it's good. I'm like, well, it's not in the Bible, but okay. I think it's more about ownership in the Bible. It was more about the First Testament, the first church, in the New Testament, in Acts. It was more about ownership. They just owned it. They fed the people. They did small groups. They did all the work of the kingdom. But now, ownership, I think it's funny that you bring that up, because that's the second time this week I've heard the same challenge in pastors. Here's what I think is happening. One, you have, again, people came back from the pandemic. It didn't, like, oh my gosh, we only came back 60, and it's like half of our church is new again. It's like, whatever the numbers are, it doesn't matter. The point is there's new people. Well, with that comes, in some case, a lack of depth to people's foundation, and they're sold out to, being all in, as we would call it, or ownership. I think there's a lot of benefit that comes from it as well. But the downside is there's just not this automatic, like, well, of course you serve. That's what you do. I've been doing this for 28 years of my whole life. I've been a Christian since I was 15 years old, and now I'm 50, and whatever. So you don't have a lot of that. The one thing that I would say is, in order to create ownership, there has to be one major thing has to shift, and that's the culture change. So what's happening is there is a culture that's being created in the church of, hey, the staff will do it. Now, I do think it ties to a staff that's more doers than leaders. But we already talked about that. That creates part of the problem. So I think you have to solve that problem. If you have a staff that's doers, you have an executive team that's doers, you're going to have a bunch of people at the church that's like, they'll do it. It just exponentially creates problems. So you have a problem there. That's got to get resolved. From doer to leader, that's got to get resolved. Now we flip over to the second portion of that, which I think is culture. So we got to solve the doing, leading problem from the staff. We also have to start leaning into a culture. Now, I always say that culture is created by 3 things: stories you tell, the heroes you make, and the things you celebrate. That's how culture is created. It's created no matter what culture it is. No matter what kind of culture you're trying to create. We want to do an invite culture. We want a generosity culture. We want more of a buy-in, ownership, all-in culture. It's always going to be created by this same 3 things. And to sum it up in a sentence, it's a matter of we've got to start telling stories and celebrating the behavior that we want repeated. So we have to start making heroes out of the people that are doing what we want done. Make heroes out of people that are generous, and you'll have a more generous church. Make heroes out of the people that are inviting, and you'll have more of an invite culture. Make heroes out of people that are all in, and you'll have more people be all in, because we all follow heroes. So you got to focus on the behavior that you want. You tell the story about the behavior that you want repeated. What behavior do you want repeated? That's the second portion. So you have a leader-doer portion in your challenge that you're facing.
Right.
You also have a culture problem. Culture's like, I always say, culture's like a raging river. It's always going in a certain direction. And if you want to rechange the direction, you're going to have to start telling stories and making heroes out of people, because culture's always what you allow and what you promote. And so as you're shifting that culture, you're telling stories about like, hey man, this is our volunteer spotlight today. This is so-and-so. Man, they serve, they're dedicated. 3 weeks later, here's our volunteer spotlight. This person, man, they came in, man, they just took ownership, and you start finding that groove where you've got social media saying volunteer spotlight. You got once a month on Sunday morning, it's volunteer spotlight. So what would it look like if 2 weeks out of the month, 3 weeks out of the month, so maybe you go social media, live, social media, live, where it's volunteer spotlight. We constantly are maybe it's twice a month, 3 times, whatever you feel comfortable with, but it's consistent. You don't do it 2 months and then not do it. You got to be consistent. If you want to shape culture, it requires consistency. But you start celebrating the volunteer culture, and you'll get buy-in. That's for sure. It just comes down to the stories that you tell. And you'll start seeing it happen. It'll change it. It'll change it in a matter of. It won't take years. I watched that with years. I watched that with an invite culture, a church that was not had a very low invite culture, and so we just said start telling stories about people that got invited or that started inviting. They went relentless with it. Probably 3 out of 4 Sundays they had a story on Sunday morning, video or live interview. 6 months later, maybe 8 months, 6 to 8 months later, their amount of first-time guests went from 6, they were averaging 6 a week to 18 a week.
Wow.
Just boom. And I'm like, that's because you're telling stories about the behavior you want repeated. And it works with any part of culture. So I would say that if you want to settle the ownership problem, start creating it that way. And then when you do that kind of story, utilize the word language, because language shapes behavior and behavior shapes culture. So you shape the language by going, man, that was a great story from Tom and Jessica, and man, the way they're all in. There's the language. Man, I love the ownership they have. You know, they're owners, not renters, and they own it. There's a little thing that we used to always say. It was a language for quite a while in the original campus we had at South Hills, where I'm the founding pastor. We used the joke was always, "Hey man, this isn't a rental car. This is our '66 Mustang," and everybody would laugh, but they would know what it meant. Like, hey dude, you rent some car, you could care less what happens to it. You got a '66 Mustang in the garage. You care about every part of it. This church is our '66 Mustang. We see a piece of trash on the ground, we pick it up. We are all in, and everybody knew what that meant. But it was the language, it was the stories that we were telling that shaped this all-in ownership feel.
I love it. That is really good. I've been meditating on a few of those things. That just really kind of helps a lot. I would say that culture, you're right. I mean, it was a reinforced culture in the past, where people just took ownership, and it has shifted over the last 5 years. And then COVID came, was even more so. That the staff was doing even more, and we have people serving, but they don't have that level. So I appreciate that a lot. That's some good language tools there to help me.
Good. Well, what else you got on your mind today? Anything else?
Okay, so last question is this, and shift gears a little bit.
Yes, sir.
In your opinion, leading a church, and even as a growing church, and resources have increased. When you don't have anything, it's really easy to steward well because you don't have anything to steward. But as
one way of looking at it,
as God has blessed you, and there's increase that's come. What are a couple great priorities in continuing to steward well, knowing that stewardship produces continued abundance and God's continual flow through our congregations. So as a pastor leading, you got staff and you got, a bigger pool that's growing. What are a couple tips that you shared, whether it's with yourself, with your staff, just to keep that level of stewardship where it needs to be?
Yeah, I do think that it's a great question. And I do think it's excuse me, I do think it's a important question because I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with stewarding the resources that we have spiritually.
Absolutely.
I think that there is, know the state of your flock. Proverbs tells us you got to know. Okay, the flock being the finances and everything that's happening. I think it's important if you haven't in the past, maybe you do, Mitch. I have no idea. I think it's important that you set up some regulations and some boundaries. How much do we spend on staffing? What percentage does it flow between this percentage and this percent? We never go higher than this, and we always keep it right here. Okay, we know that that's an important part. We know how much dollars goes to program dollars. What its program is like putting on programs and outreaches and ideas. Like, what's our percentage look like there, and are we staying inside of that budget? Are we stewarding that budget well? I think that's an important part as well. One thing I'm a big fan of is creating a restoration reserve. I think is really important. If you have a building and you know that building's going to need maintenance, try to predict the best that you can. This heating unit has a 10-year warranty. We're on our 11th year. We're probably pushing the luck now. Okay, so sometime in this year we got to fix that. So that doesn't feel as when you're like, got to write a $25,000 check. Well, it doesn't feel as bad when it was put aside anyway a long time ago, out of sight, out of mind. It's like a college fund for a kid. Here's your $50,000. It doesn't feel painful at the moment because you just saved up over time. That's called a reserve, a college reserve. But I'm giving my own term, college reserve. But if we had a restoring reserve, how do we for restoring things and rebuilding things? And so I think that's a renovation reserve is important. I think those things are all important. Having those boundaries that are set up in place. I think also in there. I think it's important that you're always thinking about any strength overdone becomes a liability. So the stronger you become financially, the more you're like, we don't need to worry about tithes and offerings. We don't need to worry about, well, we do, because that's discipleship. Mm-hmm. And okay, so we've got 22% of our people that are tithing, but that's still 78% that are not. That's a discipleship issue. So I think part of knowing the state of your flock isn't just managing the money right, it's managing the people right, and how are we moving them into a discipleship pattern. So I would add that the last part I would add is think about what does your giving calendar look like for the year? How often do we talk about tithing? Do we offer Financial Peace University twice a year? Do we know exactly, okay, we got 500 adults in the church, and just whatever the number is, doesn't matter. 500 adults in the church, 150 give under this, 150 give under this, 150 give under this. We know exactly where everybody's at. We know how to communicate to that group to help disciple them to another level. And that to me is so important, and it gets ignored when there's no money strain. It only gets attention when there's money strain.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think that should only get attention when there's money strain. I think it should get attention just as much when if someone came and wrote a check to the church and goes, here's $50 million, you're like, man, this is amazing. Does that still mean that we don't want to disciple people?
Should we stop tithing? No.
Yeah, no, we don't. So do we know who's given what? I always tell guys, hey, put your church into 3 tiers of givers. And, 0 to X amount a year, X amount to X amount, X amount to X amount. Do a dessert night once a year for each of those groups. Don't mix them together. Each of those groups. So when you're there and you're celebrating all that God's done and you're saying, giving a testimony and they're watching a video and you guys are giving out prizes and it's a fun big party and everybody's having a great time. And now it's time for you to kind of give a little 15-minute little motivational thing at the very end that once a year, thanks for all we did. And I want to challenge you this year. And that whole thing comes up. You know exactly what audience you're talking to.
That makes sense.
And then the next week when you have the second dessert night, three desserts night a year, all in the same month, the second, you know exactly who you're talking to at tier 2. Tier 3, you know exactly who you're talking to. You're not going to talk to tier 3 about tithing. You're just going to talk to them about generosity and kingdom builder mindedness. Mm-hmm. Tier 2, a little bit of tithing, kingdom builder. Tier 1, probably all tithing. Yeah. You're just going to talk to them differently. And you're going to calculate those names as they continue to move up.
That makes a lot of sense. That's really good. That's something I have not done. Is I've wanted to meet with those groups, but I haven't done it, and that makes a lot of sense. You know, we've been a church that I feel like has stewarded well. We give a lot. We want to enhance the kingdom and be a big part in that, and try to stay true to a couple other things. But I felt that part slipping. What you just said there about. You don't stop communicating about discipling your people.
Right.
Just because there's a little bit more, it doesn't mean that there's enough. I don't know if there's ever enough. So, there's more work to be done. And I want to help our church step into that next place of what God really wants us to do and the impact he wants us to make in our city and around the world. Yeah. And that requires, people that have a heart to understand generosity and giving, beyond tithing.
Mm-hmm. So I would, to the big question of finances, I would look at, okay, are we structured, healthy? Do we know our percentages? Does the board understand? Do we know the kind of cash reserves we want? All that stuff, like we need to follow the boundaries. But then also, we're again, growing people in that. And I have said it from the pulpit, many times. They laugh about it, but I'm like, if someone today writes a $200 million check, doesn't mean I wouldn't talk about tithing.
Yeah.
Because it's not something I want from you, it's something I want for you.
Amen. That's
and I want them to be blessed, and I don't want you to miss out on God's blessing, and I don't want you to miss out on this discipleship. It doesn't matter. So let's remove money as the issue and say, you just now, got $200 or $300 million someone gave you. It's like, okay, but that's not going to change this conversation.
No.
And I'm telling you, whenever you speak on giving, that little what I just did there for 1 minute, it's interesting how I've heard a lot of comments about that. Like, man, I've never thought of it that way. Like, so it's not about money. You see how it's not about money now? It's about discipleship. Because if we had all the money in the world, I'd still talk about it. And people,
I love it.
People like that. People like that a lot. Yeah, they really get it. So, anything else today, man?
Man, those are the big things that have been in my heart that I've just been wrestling around with. And when you said, hey, you want to jump on this podcast, I was like, yeah, I got some things I'd like to ask somebody that knows nothing about me. I'd like to know what he's got to say. So I appreciate that a lot. I can't wait to just dive back into a few of those things you shared. There's some great things I think that will help me take some big steps as we're just continuing to do what the Lord wants us to do here.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for being on the podcast, Mitch. I really do appreciate it.
Hey, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.